If you're looking for a pants pattern that's easy to fit, Simplicity 8056 is a great choice. It has two baseline options, slim average and curvy. From there, you can customize the side seams and crotch curve with the pattern's instructions to create a fit that you're happy with. It's like a little masterclass. I've sewn the slim option today in a size 10 for the length of view B, and I made no alterations to the standard seams or the length. The fabric I chose for this project is a charcoal-colored baby gabardine from Zuluf Fabrics. It's soft, wrinkle-resistant, and creates a polished-looking pair of slacks, just like the pattern cover. Since the material does have a 4% spandex content, I used my walking foot to ensure an even feed. And at the end of the video, you'll also see me use my blind hem foot to create an invisible stitch along the bottom hem. I'll link both feet in the description below. Join me in sewing this refined pair of pants. Let's get started. Here is the right side of my fabric for my left front pant piece. And I've gone ahead and transferred the stitching line for the fly to the front of the garment. Stay stitch at the bottom section of the fly, stitching vertically starting 1 inch above the end of our fly transferred line and ending 1 inch below it, with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now we'll place both of our front pieces right sides together, and we're going to sew from the notch transfer from the pattern piece to the dot and back stitching at the dot to secure. Now that our two front pieces are stitched together in that small section, I'm going to flip this over so I can access the left front pant once again. For that left front pant only, I'm going to clip from the outer edge to the dot, being careful not to clip through the stitching. Here are my pocket-facing pieces, and I'm going to press the longer unnotched edges to the wrong side by 1/4 inch. Now that we have those unnotched edges pressed to the inside by 1/4 inch, we're going to place the wrong side of these facing pieces on the right side of the pocket lining pieces, matching the notches and the dots. Pin in place along the outer and inner folded edges of the facing. Now we're going to baste the facings to the pocket linings along both of the notched edges. And for these inner pressed edges of the facing, we're going to stitch them in place, edge stitching close to the folded edge. Now we'll open out our front pant pieces away from each other, and we'll place our pocket lining right sides together with each of the curved pocket edges and pin in place, doing this for both sides of the front pant. Then we'll sew those pocket linings to the front pant with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then we can trim those pocket seam allowances. Then we're going to understitch that pocket lining. We're going to flip that lining over its seam allowance and then stitch along that pocket facing, stitching it to the seam allowance with about 1/8 inch seam allowance, doing this for both pocket linings. Turn your pocket linings to the inside and give both of those seams a good press. Then I'll pin those seams in place and top stitch both of those curved edges with about 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're going to be attaching our front yoke pieces to the front yoke and pocket pieces in the exact same way as we did for the pocket linings earlier, starting by pressing those curved unnotched edges to the wrong side by 1/4 inch. Now with these inner edges pressed, we'll place the wrong side of the front yokes on the right side of the front yoke and pocket, and pin in place matching the notches. Then we're going to baste the top and side edges and edge stitch along that inner folded edge of the yoke. Here is the inside of my pant with the right side of the pocket lining facing me. Place the front yoke and pocket pieces right sides together with their pocket linings, matching those inner curved edges, doing this for both pieces. And pin them together along those double notched edges. And then sew each of your front yoke and pocket pieces to the pocket linings along those inner curves with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then finish the raw edges. Now here is the front of my pants, and I'm going to pin the side edges of the pocket to the side edges of the pant, making sure to match your notches. Also match the notches to pin the pocket along the top of the pant. Then we'll also pin each of the respective center fronts. Then we'll baste all of these areas in place as pinned. I've applied fusible interfacing to the wrong side of my fly piece. Now I'm going to press the curved edge of the fly to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch. Now that that's pressed, I'll top stitch the folded edge in place from the right side of the fabric. Place the fly piece right sides together with the front of the pant on the left side, and then pin that center edge. Now we're going to sew the fly to the left front pant from the top to the large dot transferred from the pattern piece and back stitching at the dot to secure, using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And trim this seam allowance to 1/4 of an inch. Now we're going to understitch the fly, turning this fly piece over its seam allowance and stitching the fly to the seam allowance underneath with about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to place my zipper right sides together with the left fly so that the top zipper stop is 7/8 of an inch from the top raw edge of the pant. We also want the zipper tape to extend 1/4 of an inch beyond the fly seam and pin in place on the left side. Then stitch along that left zipper tape from the top to the bottom of the fly using a zipper foot. Then we'll turn the pant over to the wrong side and turn the fly to the inside along its seam. Give that seam a good press, and also press this right side of the pant to the wrong side by 3/8 of an inch from the dot to the top of the pant. I also pinned the fly in place to keep it out of the way. Now I'll turn the pant back to the right side. We're going to place that pressed edge that we pressed on the right side, pinning it in place, pressing the folded edge right up against the zipper teeth on the opposite side that we sewed. I'll first make sure everything is aligned, and I'll place the first pin. Then I'll open up my fly and continue pinning in place. And I'll baste the zipper to the right side from the top to the bottom of the fly opening. Fold the underlap piece in half wrong sides together, and then baste together all of the raw edges. Now that I have the raw edges of the underlap basted in place, I'm going to finish the side and bottom edge using my serger. Place the underlap underneath the right opening of the pant. Pin in place so that the teeth on the right side are just over the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and pin in place. Then sew along that folded edge of the right side of the pant from the top to the large dot, backstitching to secure. Close the zipper and turn the garment to the wrong side. Move the underlap out of the way and pin it in place. I'm going to remove the pin that I placed on the fly to keep it out of the way earlier. Now we'll turn the pant to the right side once again. Sew along the stitching line from the top to the seam, sewing through all thicknesses. Now I'll turn my pant to the wrong side once again. Unpin the underlap. Using a needle and thread, I'm going to tack together the underlap to the fly along the bottom edge. I'll also sew a few stitches sewing the zipper to the bottom of the underlap. And I'll trim off the excess zipper tape beyond the underlap. Then I'll turn this to the right side. And I'll sew a few short zigzag stitches at the very bottom of my fly stitching to create a bar tack. Because I used a metal zipper and I don't want to risk a needle breaking on one of the teeth, I'm just going to use my hand wheel to create that bar tack slowly, just a few short zigzag stitches right at that seam line. Here are the wrong sides of my back pants, and I'm going to pin the darts in place. Then I'll sew from the top to the bottom of the dart, leaving thread tails at the end so I can tie them in knots. And then press each dart toward its respective center. I've applied interfacing to the wrong sides of two corresponding back waistband pieces. I'll place them right sides together with the top of each back pant piece and pin in place. And sew in place with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then we'll trim those seam allowances and then press those seam allowances up toward the waistband. Now for the front of the pant, I've interfaced the left front waistband, and I'll place it right sides together with the left front of the pant and pin in place. And I'll do the same with my interfaced right front waistband, placing it right sides together with the right side of the pant and pinning in place. Note that on both sides of the center front, you will have some waistband material extending beyond the center front of the pant. Sew both waistbands to their section of the front piece with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, just as we did for the back waistband. Now I'm going to trim those seam allowances just as far as the stitching. So I'm going to leave the seam allowance of the portions that are extending beyond the center fronts fully intact. And once again, press those seam allowances up toward the waistband. Place each of your back pant pieces right sides together with the front pant unit. Pin the inseams. Then sew both of the inseams from the crotch to the bottom of the pant with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges. For each of those inseams, I finished each side of the seam allowance separately and pressed the seams open. Now I'm going to place the back pant pieces right sides together. I'm going to pin starting at the center back, then continue across to the front of the pant. From your pattern piece, you should have transferred a stitching line along the back of the pant. This stitching line indicates the 1 inch seam allowance that this pattern has here and along the side seams, which allow you to customize those seams to get a perfect fit. I'm not going to be customizing these pants beyond the standard seam allowance. I'm going to start at the back of the waistbands with the 1 inch seam allowance that's included, and then taper into that 5/8 inch seam allowance along the bottom of the crotch curve and to the front of the pant, stopping and back stitching at that dot. And I finish those seam allowances separately and press them open. which you can also do at a later step once you've adjusted the fit of the pant. With my front and back pieces right sides together, I'm going to pin both of the side seams from top to bottom. Now you can sew or baste both of the side seams from the top of the waistband to the bottom of the pant with the included 1-inch seam allowance. After that, you can follow the directions in the pattern instructions to customize the fit. And once you've customized, finish the side seams and press the seams open. Sew your back waistbands together at their center back seam. I'll press the seam open and I'll trim both sides of the seam allowance to within 5/8 of an inch. And I'll place my right and left waistband pieces, right sides together with the side seams, and sew with the 1-inch seam allowance here as well, pressing and trimming those seam allowances. For the left front facing, we're going to stay stitch the bottom edge just as we stay stitched the bottom of the fly earlier. I'm going to transfer a dot to the front of the fabric that corresponds with the center front marking from my pattern piece, making the marking at the 5/8 of an inch seam line. Then I'll stitch horizontally with the 5/8 inch seam allowance through the dot, starting 1 inch away from the dot on one side and ending 1 inch away on the other side. Clip into the fabric to the small dot, careful not to clip through the stitching, and press the remainder of the seam allowance to the wrong side along that bottom edge by 1/2 of an inch, leaving the seam allowance beyond the clipping unpressed. Pin the waistband facing to the waistband all the way around, along the upper edges. Now we can sew the waistbands together along the top edge with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. We're also going to be sewing the vertical center edges. So we can start vertically with that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, pivot at the top edge to continue all around the waistline. And when you get to the left waistband, we'll pivot once again to sew down that center front at 5/8 of an inch and pivot along the bottom extension, sew to the dot that we clipped to earlier, backstitching to secure. Then we can trim the corners at each corner of the front waistband and also trim the seam allowances all the way around. Now we can understitch the facing. Flip the facing up and away from the garment so that the seam allowance is also pressed up toward the facing. And we're going to stitch the facing to the seam allowance all the way around the upper edge of the pant with about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. As you approach the center front, it will be difficult for your presser foot to understitch all the way to the edge of the front, so just understitch as far as you can. Turn the facing to the inside, poking out the corners. And give the waistband seam a good press. With the seam allowance of the facing pressed to the inside and covering the seam line, pin it in place from the outside of the garment, all the way from center front to center front. Now I have that waistband pinned all the way around, with my pins catching that bottom folded edge of the facing. From the right side of the garment, we're going to stitch in the ditch of that waistband seam from center front to center front. I've transferred my buttonhole marking to my right front waistband and I'll sew that in place. I've also transferred the button marking onto the left front pant on the inside, and I'm going to hand sew that in place, making sure that the stitches don't exit the front of the garment. You're also going to be hand sewing a hook and bar on the inside of the garment, sewing the hook on the left front waistband at the dot marking, and the bar on the right front waistband again at the dot marking. And again, I've stitched them in place so that the thread is not visible from the opposite side. Now for the hem of the pants. I'm going to finish the raw edges all the way around. Now that those edges are finished, I've also pressed them to the wrong side by the hem allowance of 1 1/4 inches, doing this for the bottoms of both pant legs. For my hem, I'm going to be using a blind hem stitch. Once your hem is finished, your pants are complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel for more full-length sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.